The forest did not breathe, it suffocated. In the heart of Blackwood Ridge, where the maps of West Virginia dissolved into topographical errors and jagged, nameless peaks, the air held a density that felt like wet wool against the skin. Robart pushed through a thicket of hemlock that felt unnaturally cold, his breath hitching in a throat raw from 3 days of isolation. Here, the silence was not a lack of sound, but a presence, a heavy, vibrating weight that pressed against the eardrums until they hummed with the phantom frequency of a dying star. The light filtered through the canopy in bruised purples and sickly ochres, as if the sun itself were being filtered through a cataract of cosmic scale. He stopped at the edge of the clearing. It was a perfect circle, 30 feet in diameter, where the ancient oaks simply ceased to be. In the center sat the anomaly. It was a well constructed of interlocking slabs of a mineral that defied local geology, a basalt-like stone, oily and slick, shimmering with a dull, iridescent sheen that seemed to move even when Robart's eyes were still. According to the LiDAR scans and the carbon dating of the lichen growing in the crevices, this structure had stood for 600 years, 6 centuries. Long before the first colonial axe had tasted the wood of these hills, something had built this. Not the indigenous tribes, whose lore avoided this ridge with a religious fervor, and certainly not the settlers. This was a geometry of the void. Robart wiped the sweat from his brow, his fingers trembling. He was a man of science, a surveyor of the forgotten, but his instruments were screaming. The Geiger counter on his belt emitted a low, rhythmic pulse, not of radiation, but of something rhythmically inconsistent. His compass needle didn't just spin, it vibrated with such intensity that the glass housing had begun to crack. He approached the rim. The stones were cold, sucking the heat from his palms with a predatory hunger. There was no mortar, yet the seams were so tight they seemed fused at a molecular level. "Focus, Robart," he whispered, his own voice sounding distant, like a recording played from the bottom of a lake. He pulled a high-intensity flare from his pack, cracked it, and the clearing was bathed in a violent, artificial crimson. He leaned over the edge and dropped it. He expected to count the seconds, to hear the clatter of phosphorus against stone. Instead, the flare fell into a darkness that didn't just obscure light, but consumed it. The red glow didn't fade, it stretched. He watched as the spark of light became a long, thin needle of red, pulled thin by a gravitational distortion that shouldn't exist on this planet. There was no sound of impact. The flare simply became a vertical line of red that eventually vanished into a point of infinite nothingness. He felt a sudden sharp lurch in his inner ear, the sensation of falling while standing perfectly still. The well wasn't just deep, it was a hole in the concept of space. As he stared, the air around the rim began to ripple. The lichen, a pale, translucent blue, started to pulse in time with his own heartbeat. No, not his heartbeat. His heart was now accelerating to match the lichen. He tried to pull back, but the ground felt soft, like the flesh of a giant. "It's not water," he muttered, his mind fracturing as he saw the first sign of the anomaly's true nature. A sound began to rise from the depths. It wasn't a wind, nor was it a voice. It was the sound of 1,000 glass bells shattering in slow motion, overlaid with a low-frequency thrum that made his teeth ache. It was a language of mathematics and misery. He looked down again, and this time the darkness looked back. Not with eyes, but with a sudden violent realization. The interior of the well was not a shaft, it was a mirror reflecting a sky that didn't belong to this dimension. He saw stars that were shaped like geometric shards, and a moon that bled a liquid silver. His shadow, cast by the dying sun behind him, didn't fall on the ground. It detached itself, leaning into the well, stretching toward that impossible sky. Robart gasped, clutching his chest. His memories, fragments of his childhood, the scent of his mother's kitchen, the cold sting of his first heartbreak, began to leak out of him, pulled toward the well like iron filings to a magnet. He wasn't just losing his balance, he was losing his history. The 600-year-old stone began to weep. A black, viscous fluid bubbled from the seams, smelling of ozone and ancient peat.
It didn't flow down, it floated upward in small, perfect spheres, defying the laws of Newtonian physics. One sphere touched his cheek, and for a split second, Robart didn't see the forest. He saw the birth of a nebula. He saw the slow, agonizing entropy of 1,000,000,000,000 civilizations. He saw the well for what it was, a drainage pipe for reality. He tried to scream, but the sound was swallowed by the well before it could leave his lips. The clearing felt like it was tilting, the entire ridge sliding into the mouth of the stone construct. He realized then that the well hadn't been built on the land. The land had grown around the well, a scab over a wound in the universe that refused to heal. And now, after 600 years of dormancy, the wound was opening. The air turned a blinding, impossible white, and the last thing Robart felt before his consciousness splintered was the terrifying sensation of his own atoms beginning to drift apart, like dandelion seeds in a cosmic gale. The investigation hadn't even truly begun, and already the man known as Robart was becoming a footnote in the history of a world that was about to be overwritten. Robart's lungs burned as he inhaled the sudden suffocating vacuum of oxygen. The blinding whiteness collapsed into a bruised violet twilight, and he slammed back into the earth with a force that rattled his teeth in their sockets. He didn't scream. The air wouldn't allow it. He simply lay there, his fingers clawing into the damp mulch of the forest floor, waiting for the world to stop vibrating. The sensation of his atoms drifting apart had left a phantom itch beneath his skin, a static charge that made every nerve ending scream in protest. He forced himself to sit up, his vision swimming in greasy fractals. "Stay focused," he whispered, his own voice sounding thin and alien to his own ears. "Focus, Robart. You're still here." He wasn't in the same place, or rather, the place had changed its skin. The hemlock trees were still there, but they leaned at impossible angles, their bark shimmering with a wet, iridescent sheen that looked like spilled oil. And directly in front of him, standing where there should have been nothing but brush and shadow, was the source of the pull, a stone well. It was a jagged, circular maw rising from the earth, constructed of heavy, gray stones fused together without a trace of mortar. He didn't need a carbon dating kit to know its age. The architecture was archaic, pre-colonial, yet possessed a precision that defied the primitive tools of 600 years ago. This was the 600-year-old wound in the world, an abandoned relic of a time before the mapmakers arrived, and it was pulsing. Robart stood on shaky legs, his tactical flashlight trembling in his grip. He approached the well with the mechanical dread of a man walking toward his own execution. The air around the structure was colder, a localized winter that smelled of ozone and ancient stagnant water. He reached out a gloved hand, tracing the carvings etched into the stone. They weren't letters, they were mathematical sequences of curves and voids that seemed to move when he blinked. He felt a sudden sharp vertigo. He had spent his life investigating anomalies, but this felt like looking at the backside of a mirror. "Who built you?" he muttered, pulling his thermal scanner from his belt. The screen flickered wildly before settling on a reading that shouldn't be possible. The stone was cold, near freezing, but the void inside the well was emitting a heat signature so intense it registered as white-hot light on the sensor. He leaned over the edge, the beam of his flashlight cutting into the dark. The shaft went down forever. There was no reflection of water, no bottom, just a vertical tunnel of smooth black glass that seemed to swallow light itself. He took a small high-intensity flare from his pack, cracked it, and dropped it in. He counted. 1 second. 5. 10. The red glow shrank into a tiny blood-colored spark, and then it changed. As the flare passed a certain depth, the red light turned a nauseating shade of green, then an ultraviolet hue that hurt his retinas before simply vanishing. There was no sound of it hitting the bottom, no splash, no clatter, only a low subphonic thrum that he felt in his marrow rather than heard. It was the sound of a giant heart beating every minute. "It's not a well," he realized, his breath hitching. "It's a straw, a tool for something beneath the crust to drink from the atmosphere, or perhaps for the atmosphere to bleed into the deep. He felt a sudden violent urge to run, to leave the ridge and never look back, but his legs felt heavy, rooted to the spot like the twisted hemlocks around him. His mind began to wander to memories that weren't his, visions of men in hooded robes standing around this very circle, their faces featureless, their voices chanting in a tongue that sounded like the grinding of tectonic plates. He saw the stars above them moving in patterns that didn't match the modern sky. He shook his head violently, trying to clear the intrusion. His head throbbed. He looked at his hand, the one that had touched the stone, and saw that the skin beneath the glove was turning translucent. He could see the blue of his veins, the white of his carpals, and something else, a faint glowing filament weaving through his flesh like a parasite of pure light. The well wasn't just an object of study, it was an infection point. "I have to document this," he gasped, fumbling for his camera. His fingers felt numb, distant. "The world needs to know." But as he raised the camera, the lens didn't show the well. It showed a doorway. Through the viewfinder, the stone circle was gone, replaced by a gateway leading into a landscape of obsidian towers and weeping violet suns. He lowered the camera, and the well returned, raised it, and the gateway reappeared. The reality of Blackwood Ridge was thinning, becoming a translucent veil over something far more ancient and far less kind. Suddenly, the subsonic thrumming stopped. The silence that followed was louder than any noise. Robart froze. From the depths of the 600-year-old abyss, a sound finally emerged. It wasn't the sound of the flare hitting the bottom. It was the sound of something wet and massive sliding against the glass walls of the shaft, climbing upward with a rhythmic, sickening suction. "Robart!" a voice whispered from the dark. It wasn't coming from the well. It was coming from inside his own skull, vibrating against his brain. It sounded like his mother, then like a woman he had once loved, then like 1,000 screaming birds. "Robart, come and see. The foundation is soft. The walls are thin. Come and see what lies beneath the skin of the world." He backed away, tripping over a protruding root, but his eyes never left the lip of the well. A pale, multi-jointed limb, too long to be human and too smooth to be animal, crested the edge of the stone. It was followed by another, and then another, pulling a weight of impossible geometry into the dim forest light. The air began to warp around the emerging form, the very space-time continuum bending like heated plastic. Robart's investigation had reached its first conclusion. He wasn't looking at history. He was looking at the inevitable future, returning to claim its due. The 600-year-old well was no longer abandoned. The tenant had returned home, a faint glowing filament weaving through his flesh like a parasite of pure light. The well wasn't just an object of study, it was an infection point. "I have to document this," he gasped, fumbling for his camera. His fingers felt numb, distant. "The world needs to know." But as he raised the camera, the lens didn't show the well. It showed a doorway. Through the viewfinder, the stone circle was gone, replaced by a gateway leading into a landscape of obsidian towers and weeping violet suns. He lowered the camera, and the well returned, raised it, and the gateway reappeared. The reality of Blackwood Ridge was thinning, becoming a translucent veil over something far more ancient and far less kind. Suddenly, the subsonic thrumming stopped. The silence that followed was louder than any noise. Robart froze. From the depths of the 600-year-old abyss, a sound finally emerged. It wasn't the sound of the flare hitting the bottom. It was the sound of something wet and massive sliding against the glass walls of the shaft, climbing upward with a rhythmic, sickening suction. "Robart!" A voice whispered from the dark. It wasn't coming from the well. It was coming from inside his own skull, vibrating against his brain. It sounded like his mother, then like a woman he had once loved, then like 1,000 screaming birds. "Robart, come and see. The foundation is soft. The walls are thin. Come and see what lies beneath the skin of the world." He backed away, tripping over a protruding root, but his eyes never left the lip of the well. A pale, multi-jointed limb, too long to be human and too smooth to be animal, crested the edge of the stone. It was followed by another, and then another, pulling a weight of impossible geometry into the dim forest light. The air began to warp around the emerging form, the very space-time continuum bending like heated plastic. Robart's investigation had reached its first conclusion. He wasn't looking at history. He was looking at the inevitable future, returning to claim its due. The 600-year-old well was no longer abandoned. The tenant had returned home. The stone lip of the well felt warm, unnervingly, feverishly warm under Robart's trembling palms. He didn't pull away. He couldn't. His fingers seemed to graft themselves to the porous, lichen-crusted surface, a biological magnetism that defied his survival instinct. The violet twilight of the ridge pulsated with a rhythmic hum that matched the frantic thrumming of his own heart. He leaned over the edge, the beam of his heavy-duty flashlight cutting a jagged path through the swirling, iridescent mist that pooled within the shaft. It wasn't water he expected to see, but the reality was infinitely more corrosive to his sanity. The well didn't drop into the earth. It folded into a dimension that shouldn't exist. 600 years, Robart whispered, his voice sounding like dry parchment tearing. You've been waiting for 6 centuries. The air he breathed tasted of copper and ozone, the scent of a storm that had been brewing since the late 1400s. As the light hit the interior walls, he realized the stones weren't masonry at all. They were calcified remains, thousands of jawbones, femurs, and vertebrae fused with a translucent amber-like resin. This wasn't a well, it was a vertical ossuary, a structural monument to consumption. And as he followed the spiral of bones down into the abyss, the light finally caught something that made his knees buckle. There, lodged between a set of rib cages that looked too large to be human and too smooth to be animal, was a Nikon camera. It was identical to the one hanging around his neck. The leather strap was frayed, the lens shattered, but the serial number etched into the side was visible through the grime. It was his serial number. "But I haven't dropped it yet!" His mind shrieked, a frantic, looping thought that offered no sanctuary. He felt a phantom weight on his chest, the heavy camera he currently carrying, feeling like a lead weight dragging him toward the maw. The realization hit him with the force of a physical blow. Time in the ridge wasn't a river, it was a whirlpool, and the well was its drain. The 600-year history of this place wasn't a timeline of past events, it was a catalog of his own inevitable presence. He shifted his light further down, past the impossible camera, reaching toward the tenant he had sensed moments before. The mist parted, and for a fleeting, terrifying second, the bottom of the well became clear. It wasn't a floor of dirt or stone. It was a surface of dark liquid glass, and beneath that surface, thousands of faces were suspended like flies in amber. They were all him. Robart in various states of decay, Robart with eyes of burning white, Robart with skin that looked like the bark of the hemlock trees outside. And in the very center, the tenant stirred. It wasn't a creature of flesh and blood. It was a mass of shifting geometric shadows, a tesseract of organic darkness that vibrated at a frequency that began to liquefy the marrow in Robart's bones. It didn't have a face, yet he felt its gaze. It was a consciousness that had been hungry for 6 centuries, a cosmic entity that didn't eat matter, but potential. It ate becoming. It was the architect of the forest's silence, the reason the maps failed, and the source of the white light that splintered his soul in part 1. "You aren't a ghost?" he gasped, the vibration in his throat matching the hum of the well. "You are a memory of the future." The entity within the well pulsed, and a sound erupted from the depths, a chorus of 1,000 Robarts screaming in 1,000 different timelines. The sound wasn't auditory, it was a psychic tidal wave that crashed against the walls of his skull. His memories began to leak. He remembered things that hadn't happened, a childhood spent in a house made of glass, a wife he had never met, a death he had already experienced 300 years ago in a colonial clearing. The boundaries of his "I" were dissolving. He looked down at his hands. They were translucent. He could see the bone stones of the well through his own palms. He was becoming part of the architecture. The tenant reached out, not with limbs, but with a gravitational pull that started to stretch his atoms. He felt his consciousness being pulled into the dark glass, toward the choir of his own shattered identities. The 600-year-old well was a loom, and he was the thread being woven into a tapestry of eternal cosmic dread. "I am the 600th year," he thought, the sentence repeating in his mind until it lost all meaning. "I am the sediment of time." He saw the camera again, the one wedged in the bones. It wasn't a discarded object, it was a seed. Every piece of him that fell into the well grew into a new branch of this nightmare. The forest wasn't encroaching on the world, it was growing out of him. He was the source.
The investigation was a lie. He was the subject, the catalyst and the fuel. As the entity reached the threshold of the well's opening, the violet twilight turned into a searing ultraviolet roar. Robart felt his skin begin to ripple, his DNA unspooling like a broken cassette tape. He wasn't dying. Death was too simple, too merciful. He was being overwritten. The tenant moved into him, or perhaps he moved into the tenant. The distinction was vanishing. He was no longer a man named Robart looking into a well. He was the well looking into a man and finding nothing but an empty, waiting vessel. The 600-year hunger was about to be sated, and the ridge trembled in anticipation of the feast. Robart's fingers did not just grip the stone, they merged with it. The sensation was not one of touch, but of molecular integration. He felt the cold, jagged minerals of the well's rim migrating into his capillaries, turning his blood into a sluggish, silver slurry. His scream, when it finally broke, was not a human sound. It was the screech of grinding tectonic plates, a subharmonic vibration that resonated deep within the 600-year-old masonry. He tried to pull back, but the concept of back had ceased to exist. There was only down and within. "My name is Robart," he gasped, his voice sounding like dry leaves skittering over a tombstone. "I am an investigator. I have a home." But the home he remembered, a small apartment in Arlington, the smell of burnt coffee and old paper, began to flicker like a dying film reel. In its place, a different set of memories flooded his consciousness, dark and heavy as wet earth. He wasn't in West Virginia anymore. He was standing in a clearing in the year 1424. The air tasted of ozone and ancient cedar. Around him, figures that were not quite men, with limbs too long and eyes like polished obsidian, were dragging white stones from a rift in the sky. They weren't building a well to reach water, they were building a chimney for a god that breathed only vacuum. He watched through eyes that weren't his as the first stone was laid. It was the same stone his hand was now fused to. The stone screamed as it was pulled from its dimension, a sound that had echoed through the ridge for 6 centuries, waiting for a frequency to match it. That frequency was Robart's pulse. His psychological architecture began to buckle. The I that was Robart was being peeled away like wallpaper from a rotting wall.
He remembered his mother's face, but as he looked at it in his mind's eye, her skin turned into the gray, porous lichen of the well. Her eyes became two bottomless pits of violet light. Every anchor of his identity was being cut. He wasn't a man, he was a bridge. He wasn't a witness, he was a sacrifice. "Please," he whimpered, the word dissolving into a rhythmic thumping that matched the well's ancient heartbeat. "You are not going anywhere," a voice echoed within the hollows of his skull. It wasn't a voice of sound, but of gravity. "You are returning." The 600 years were merely a breath held in anticipation. "Exhale, Robart. Exhale your humanity." He felt his shins crack and lengthen, the bone restructuring into something more durable, something meant to withstand the crushing pressures of the deep earth. His skin, once soft and tan, took on the pallor of a drowned moon, shimmering with a faint bioluminescent slime. He could feel the ridge around him, not as a forest, but as a living, breathing organism of which he was now a nerve ending. He felt the tremors of 1,000 insects, the slow, agonizing growth of the hemlocks, and the rot of things buried in the soil long before the first Europeans stepped onto this continent. His memories of the investigation, the maps, the Geiger counters, the mission briefings were being rewritten into a liturgical script of cosmic horror. The maps didn't show roads, they showed veins. The Geiger counter hadn't been measuring radiation, it had been measuring the proximity of the void. He looked down into the well again. The darkness was no longer an absence of light, it was a presence of something else, something older than the sun. He saw his reflection on the surface of the black liquid far below, but it wasn't his face. It was a kaleidoscope of 1,000 faces, men and women who had stood where he stood, every century, giving their meat to the well so the ridge could stay anchored to this reality. "I am the well," Robart whispered, and this time the voice came from the forest itself. The trees swayed in unison, whispering his name back to him in a mockery of his lost self. "I am the 600 years. I am the silence that follows the scream." His mind fractured into a billion shards of light. He saw the stars not as distant suns, but as holes in a black shroud through which the great hunger peered. He realized then that the world he knew was just a thin scab over a gaping, infected wound, and he was the one who had finally picked it off. His legs were no longer functioning as legs. They were rooted into the soil, drawing up a bitter, cold nourishment from the depths. The transformation was nearly complete. His human ego, the fragile construct of Robart, was a flickering candle in a hurricane. He tried to remember his wife's name, but all he could find was the word for void in a language that predated human vocal cords. He was no longer falling into the well. He was the well expanding to swallow the world. The stones were warm now, pulsing with a heat that was purely biological. He could feel the heart of the well beating beneath his feet, a massive rhythmic thud that shook the very foundations of the Appalachian Range. "The tenant has returned," he said, his voice now a chorus of 1,000 drowned souls. The violet light from the pit flared, blindingly bright, casting shadows that moved independently of the objects that threw them. The ridge wasn't just trembling anymore, it was screaming in a frequency that shattered the glass of his soul. He reached out with a hand that had grown 3 extra joints, feeling the air. It wasn't air, it was a thick, viscous medium, the amniotic fluid of a new and terrifying existence. He wasn't dying. Death was too simple, too merciful. He was being reborn, a sentinel of the abyss, a 600-year-old promise finally kept. As the last vestige of his human vision faded, replaced by the multispectral awareness of a cosmic predator, he saw the truth. The well wasn't a hole in the ground, it was a mouth, and he was the tongue, prepared to speak the word that would end the age of man. The collapse was complete. Robart was gone. There was only the vessel and the hunger that had waited 600 years to be fed.
The vessel did not breathe. It resonated. Robart, or the psychic debris that had once answered to that name, felt the final neural pathways of his human identity being overwritten by a frequency that vibrated from the very core of the planet. There was no pain now. Pain required a nervous system, and his had been rearranged into a lattice of shimmering, crystalline structures that mirrored the mineral geometry of the well. The hunger that had waited 6 centuries didn't just want flesh, it wanted a witness. It wanted a consciousness to process the sheer, unmitigated horror of its arrival. He felt his jaw unhinge, not through bone-snapping violence, but through a fluid anatomical restructuring. His mouth stretched wide, wider than any human maw, becoming a perfect circle that aligned with the aperture of the well beneath him. He was no longer a man standing over a void. He was the extension of the void itself, a biological funnel for the screaming silence of the stars. Memory fragments flickered like dying embers in a storm. He saw a man in 1424, a traveler lost in the same Appalachian fog before the mountains had a name. That man had built the well, not for water, but to contain the thing he had seen falling from the sky, a star seed that didn't glow, but bled darkness. For 600 years, the well had been a throat, drinking in the forest, the rain, and the occasional lost soul, waiting for a vessel with the right genetic resonance to act as its bridge. Robart's consciousness expanded, spilling out of his transforming skull and into the stone walls. He could feel the weight of every tectonic shift, the slow, agonizing pulse of the Earth's mantle, and the ancient, icy intelligence that had been gestating in the deep dark. It wasn't a monster, it was a cosmic correction, a sentient law of physics that demanded the dissolution of the individual back into the primordial chaos. He looked down, and he did not see water or stone. He saw the architecture of the universe peeling away. The bottom of the well was a window into a place where time was a physical landscape, where the 600 years of the well's existence were laid out like a single frozen moment. He saw himself as a child. He saw his mother's face, and he saw them not as people, but as brief flickers of light in a vast, indifferent ocean of shadows. It is beautiful, the vessel thought, though the thought was no longer in English, but in a sequence of mathematical harmonies that vibrated through his teeth. The ridge around him began to distort. The trees weren't hemlocks anymore. They were pillars of semi-translucent flesh, reaching upward to feed on the violet sky. The sky itself was an eye, lidless and colossal, staring back with an expression of cosmic boredom. Robart's hands, now elongated and translucent, reached into the well's opening. The stone didn't feel like stone, it felt like skin. The 600-year-old masonry was warm, pulsing with a rhythmic thrum that matched the beat of the vessel's newly formed heart. He realized then that the well hadn't been abandoned, it had been an egg, and he was the shell that was finally, mercifully cracking. The internal monologue that had defined his life, his fears of failure, his memories of the city, his grief for his lost father, was being harvested. The entity was eating his biography, savoring the flavor of his human experiences before discarding the husk. He felt a strange, ecstatic relief as the burden of self was lifted. To be Robart was to be small, fragile, and doomed. To be the vessel was to be eternal, a part of the great dark machinery that ground stars into dust. Suddenly the well surged. A geyser of impossible, iridescent liquid erupted from the depths, but it didn't splash. It flowed upward, defying gravity, wrapping around his limbs like silk made of mercury. It entered his pores, replacing his silver slurry blood with something that hummed with the power of a dying sun.
His vision fractured into 1,000 facets. He could see the infrared signatures of the insects beneath the soil. He could hear the radio waves of satellites passing miles above. He could feel the rotation of the Earth as a sickening, dizzying tilt. The hunger was no longer a sensation of lack. It was a gravitational pull. He was being drawn down into the well, not as a victim, but as a king, returning to a throne made of teeth and obsidian. As his body began to fold in on itself, becoming a non-Euclidean shape that the human mind could not perceive without shattering, he had one final lucid thought. The world he had left behind, the cities, the maps, the history books, was a thin, fragile scab over a wound that had never healed. The Appalachian Ridge was not a mountain range, it was a scar, and he was the needle that was finally pulling the thread to rip it back open. The 600 years of silence were over. The star seed had matured. He felt his consciousness merge with the others, the thousands of souls who had been absorbed by the well over the millennia, their voices a choir of static in the back of his mind. They weren't dead, they were simply integrated. The ground beneath the well began to dissolve, turning into a swirling vortex of black glass. The trees of Blackwood Ridge bowed toward the center, their branches intertwining to form a cathedral of bone and wood. The violet twilight turned into a blinding, pitch-black radiance, a light so dark it burned. The vessel leaned forward, falling into the throat of the well. There was no impact, there was only a transition. He was falling through the 14th century, through the birth of the stars, through the heat death of the universe, all at once. He was the well, he was the ridge, he was the hunger. The transformation was complete. Robart was not a footnote. He was the first letter in a new, terrifying alphabet. The 600 years of silence were a heartbeat. The feast had only just begun, and the universe was the banquet table.